Alright, now it's time for some tough love. What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another day in Eternum. This time around we're going to be having a very important discussion about what to expect from the New World MMO. I just want to start off by saying as a disclaimer that nothing we talk about in this video is guaranteed to happen during its beta and launch phase, but after so long of going through the same cycle where we jump into these games with insane levels of excitement, I think calmly talking about this sort of thing and keeping it in the back of our heads will make for a much healthier approach to this game and might also assist with our gameplay longevity in it. And what I'm talking about are the issues that may arise when we finally get our hands on Amazon's very own New World MMO. A big reason we're going to be talking about this as well is due to the changes that we've seen to the core functions of the game, whether it's the PvP system or PvE and other mechanics that we've learned about. The shift in opinions about the game has been major, to the point of a lot of people either starting to get more interested in the game and dive right into it, or those that have written it off entirely because of what they feel it caters to. Because of this, it's very likely that once we get both into the beta phase and launch, that this game will be under a mega huge microscope, and things that would normally be classified as minor issues in other games could end up being judged very differently. For example, on the very first day, games in this genre are notorious for having incredibly bad launch days, and although we've seen some fairly smooth ones, it's usually a roll of a dice whether it's game-breaking bugs, server crashes, or optimization issues that might just rear their ugly heads. So in this game, because of the company behind it being Amazon and how they've changed it from the previous version, something as simple as multiple game crashes or the server being down for 6 hours could cause someone to write off the game for the next few years to come. And of course, no one is obligated to deal with issues of this magnitude, but if you go into these titles with balanced expectations, you're probably going to be easier able to hold out until these types of issues get fixed, or roll with the punches until a couple patches start coming through. Over the past few years, we've had numerous titles that have launched in very bad states or semi-bad states, and quite a few of those have never got fixed or even made an attempt to improve themselves based on player feedback. Or maybe they didn't have the money that's necessary to do so, but there were titles that may or may not have started out in a bad state that over time had completely transformed themselves into the titans that we know today. I can slightly but well enough remember the problems we had in Elder Scrolls Online when it came to CYRODIL PvP during its launch, whether it was the optimization issues or balancing. It definitely had its fair share of issues in a few aspects of the game, and other titles were no different. Final Fantasy XIV originally started out as being a game that was largely dismissed by the gaming community, and yet they managed to conduct without any doubt in my mind one of the best MMO shutdowns in all of our gaming history. And despite what praises or issues that anyone might have with that game, its story-based content and player versus environment raiding experience has earned its place in many people's hearts. And not just those games. Guild Wars 2, Albion Online, Star Wars The Old Republic, a lot of them had both severe and minor issues during their releases collectively that drove many people away. And for me, vanilla World of Warcraft was one of the first massively multiplayer experiences that I ever had, after I had finished falling in love with RuneScape back in the early 2000s. Now during this time I heavily regard it as the golden age of MMOs because of the sheer amount of games that we had in this genre to choose from. I remembered all my special experiences and all the people I met in games like Mabinogi, or Age of Wushu under leading the Hattori Guild, the Alpha, beta state, and first few weeks of ArcAge's original launch, or Pirates of the Caribbean Online even, and in between all of those and afterwards there were countless more. But over time myself, and a lot of others I'm sure, had grown tired of how after all those good times, we started to fall prey to the worst experiences imaginable. Several different games with lazy development or heavy influence microtransactions or outright pay to win, they all started to show their ugly heads, and they took advantage of a whole lot of players in this genre that were just itching for more of those good times. This left a lot of us in states of being pessimistic or distrust. It was harder to trust the developers, and sometimes, even after the game would launch and we would see the reviews, months down the line they could completely flip it on its own head and end up killing the game because of it. That's why when we look at a game like New World, that's a big part of the reason why you would see all these gamers act the way they do, whether it be in a very hopeful or hyped up manner, or even in one that may seem hostile to the naked eye. And even if someone's very new to the genre, it could be hard to tell the difference between someone like that and the rest. But the first part of the truth is, those players that have spent years hoping for something more or to get that golden age back, and the players that might even look at a title and bash it or write it off without trusting the game for one reason or another, there's a lot of different justifiable reasons for both sides of these. And after all this time, I feel like I can truly understand that, because I've also been on both sides of that front. Maybe not as actively on one side or the other, but I've been there too. But the other side of this truth is, like I mentioned in my 2020 upcoming MMOs video, if we want to be able able to trust these developers again, or if we want a shot at getting the golden age of MMOs and MMORPGs back, then every single one of these upcoming titles deserves a chance from us, and this should be something that we should strive to give them. These games are supposed to be here for our enjoyment. That's the most basic reason why we all became gamers, whether it was to escape our realities no matter how bad or good, or we just needed something to fill the hours of our days. That's what these games are supposed to be here for. And the developers that make them are either people that wanted to capitalize on that, or they're people that wanted to do everything in their power to continue to provide that experience for us. And it will be very important in the coming years for us to remember that, just as food for thought. But the discussion we're going to be having today will be solely tied to New World. At this point, we've received a lot of different details about how the game and its mechanics will function. I know that some might feel that we still don't have enough or they're simply hungry for more, but me personally, I feel like we've received more than enough information to know what we're getting into. And because of that, we've had plenty of discussions about how the game will work and how great it would be to see certain features that have worked in other titles in the game's future. But the one thing I feel like we also need to talk about is the issues that may arise. These issues will be viewed differently by everyone. Some may not find them as detrimental to the game's future as others, or may even consider them minor. But in other people's cases, they could very well be game breaking. And ultimately, if we jump into the game knowing that these are possibilities that could in fact take time to tweak or fix, or might affect the game, it might end up being much better as opposed to not expecting or not thinking about them at all. Without further delay, let's go ahead and talk about the 7 minor or major issues that could arise during the game's beta or launch phase. The first and probably one of the most important topics we'll cover in this video is going to be balancing issues. This one right here is guaranteed to be one of the worst of the bunch. Probably one that both players and developers hate just as one could possibly imagine. The thing with balancing is that it not only ties into PvP content, but also PvE. And not only is this something that you have to worry about when the game first comes out, but this issue is something that will stick with the game throughout its entire lifespan and throughout a lot of our playtimes. And on top of that, sometimes changes that are made to balancing for player versus environment based content might just end up messing something else entirely up on the PvP side, and vice versa. That's one reason why this one seems to be one of the hardest to get correct. And Amazon's New World will probably be no different in this regard. Especially because, and we'll touch some more on this later, when you have people testing your game, whether it's in an alpha state, or you have teams of quality assurance, or even beta phases, having tens or hundreds of players testing things out at any given moment can end up being massively different from having thousands. Especially when all those thousands think in different ways and break or explore options that you may never have thought of. And from what we've seen from New World's combat system so far, we know that it's action combat. The aiming system for the bows and muskets will come down to skill just like our melee-based counterparts, but anytime that you're dealing with an attribute system like this game does have, or you have skill trees or weapon trees to be exact, there's always going to be combinations that are much more powerful and those that are much weaker. Who's to say, for instance, that a humongous ground pound like this from the Warhammer won't one or two shot you, or getting a spear tossed at you won't leave your character feeling like a stuck pig depending on the character's attribute build. There's a lot of possibilities that could happen here, and we might even see things like builds that are completely unkillable due to tankiness or skill choices. In PvE, there could be weapons that are completely useless for fighting in comparison to others, and it could be to the point where every single person disregards one weapon choice in favor of another. And doing so as a result could end up cutting down the time it takes to grind by a lot. This is something that we will have to watch out for, because with all these new weapon additions that we've seen from what we've learned, when these weapons are coming in and still being tweaked, there's no telling which ones will end up performing the best or worst, or even having ridiculous results to the point of being overpowered. The next one is probably one that could be in the middle between major and minor, depending on who's looking at it, but is just as important as the rest of them, and in some cases is very much expected from newly released games, and that is the amount of PvE and PvP content that it will have. Now, it's true that we already know of quite a few content pieces that will be coming across in-game. To name a few, we've seen on the PvE side, the arenas, the corrupted breaches, the questing, town projects, PvE and PvP faction missions, and more. And on the PvP side, we will have the territory war and open world opt-in PvP, but it's no secret that on both sides of the game, that many people feel like it might not be enough. We are now in an age of gaming where some players have more than enough time in their day to max out characters in the span of a week in most MMOs. And with what's going on currently in the world, having the time to do this will be a lot more likely likely than before. But even to get to that point, it needs to be something that offers variety and enjoyment for the player the majority of the way through it. On the PvE side, you can certainly expect it to be a grind. Most games in this genre are made up of repetitive grind or have some sort of repetition during the leveling process. And with sandbox titles, this is something that should be expected even more. Take a game like EVE Online, Mortal, Albion, all these games, and if you were to jump into them right now on a fresh character, the time it would take for you to cap out on progression in a modern traditional MMO would likely pale in comparison to something you would see in games like those. So far, Amazon Game Studios does seem to want to hold true to the sandbox elements of the game, which is great to see. But what this means is, despite what you may have seen or experienced before, the leveling process having a lot of grind in this game might just be something you should expect to happen. When we get into the game, there's no guarantee if we'll have access to the invasion system right off the bat or some of the other features that we talked about previously. Those might take time to implement, so this is something we should keep in the back of our minds as something that could arise. And it'll be important to find things to do in the game to continue being productive or having fun, or at the very least I would try to keep looking back if the game turned out to not have enough content for you to enjoy right off the bat. For PvP, this will be just as important. We already know that the PvP system has in fact been changed to feature opt-in open world PvP, and it's no secret that there are many players who are okay with the changes and also those who are against it. But all in all, there will be people that look solely for PvP experiences in this game, and we have talked about speculation or suggestions for the future of Amazon Game Studios that Amazon Game Studios may be able to take despite the open world PvP aspect no longer being a part of their main vision. We've talked about them implementing things like PvP arenas, PvP battlegrounds, leaderboards that offer rewards to the players with the best stats for player versus player fighting, or even something like an honor vendor. And the reason I suggest this is because even if you don't have open world PvP in your game, there will still be players that would love nothing more than to log on at 8 in the morning and fight other people until 8 in the evening that same day. Even if you put PvP objectives in the open world that players could fight over in their respective factions, it could just be a circle on the map that turns into a deathmatch once you enter it, and players have to fight for rewards or just fight in general with their factions and teammates. Even that could be something that could satisfy that side of the players. And ultimately, how they've described the territory war thus far, I don't believe that everyone will have the opportunity to experience these at all times, especially if the attacking company is on your same faction and the slots are full, since it's only 50 versus 50 total after all. And for quite a bit of people, this might end up being very crushing to lose the opportunity to participate in what seems to be the best part of the PvP experience for New World. And this also ties into what I talked about in a previous video on how you should never time gate PvP activities, by basically requiring that a player be on at a certain time to experience them. This is an aspect that should be going on all day long if your game caters to both sides, because since anyone can just go out and experience the player versus environment side of the game anytime they want to, isn't it fair for the people that like player versus player content to be given that same opportunity? But no matter what, whether we do or do not get a lot of options on both sides of content, this is something that can always be added over time. And it's going to be very important for us as the players to suggest additions and improvements to these types of content until they happen. Make extra sure to keep this in mind. The next topic will probably sound like a no-brainer to some people and might easily fit into the category of minor, since it's almost a guarantee with launches and testing phases. But this one is the bugs and glitches. In this one, I also wanted to expand over the optimization and server performance because this one seems to be the best one to throw them in. Now, like we've said before though, even though games in this genre are notorious for having issues with their server performance and things like that during their launch and testing phases, it's no secret that Amazon has access to some extremely powerful hardware on this front. So it's hard to say whether we can expect frequent server crashes, but it's something we should never rule out because yet again, hundreds and hundreds of players testing the game is going to be far different than thousands being in it. Luckily, we won't have to worry about things like terraforming because in some sandboxes, when you have all those players queuing up all those different interactions at the same time, it could end up putting a heavy strain on the game and its servers as a result. Saw a lot of this happening with games like Life is Feudal. It did happen a lot on the survival version of the game, where player servers were much smaller and less powerful. But even in the MMO version, we had entire server grids going down and sometimes a really good amount of lag because of stuff like this. The previous alpha of New World ran pretty well for myself and a good chunk of others, so all things considered, hopefully they've made improvements or kept it running in about the same place once we get into the beta phase of the game. The bugs and glitches on the other hand, that's something that I feel is bound to happen. We might get stuck in rocks or have a tough time with monsters glitching out or our own characters, maybe even ones that affect our gameplay. Even though there is currently a closed alpha phase going on, I'm sure they're going to get a lot of feedback from it when the actual game comes into play with the huge amount of us running around in there. I have no doubts in my mind that a lot of us might end up breaking something here and there, or the new bugs and glitches will pop up as the patches and content gets added from that point on. But just like any game, this is yet another one that can be resolved given time, and hopefully with enough dedication and skill from the dev team, this might even be one of the last things we'll have to worry about. For the fourth topic, we start to get into a bigger discussion on the game's mechanics and how we might get impacted by the new system we'll be experiencing in New World. And this one has to do with the possible imbalance of the factions. So what we know currently is that there are 3 factions we can choose between, and we get the option to join one upon reaching level 10 in the game. The faction system ties heavily into the territory war system and allows us to fight with others in our faction to claim territories and set taxation accordingly to the players. When a territory is not already claimed, we can visit the location to pay a fee to obtain it, but anytime a company gets made, it gets solely tied to the faction that the leader is a part of, and everyone that's interested in joining that company or guild will need to join that faction as well. And in terms of attacking other territories, we'll need to do what's called PvP missions to start gaining influence for our faction in that region so it can be thrown into a state where we can attack it. The part where this could get a little messy is where the size of the factions come in. Factions being in balance is something that seems like it's bound to happen at one point or another for games that offer this system. You'd see it of course in a game like World of Warcraft with Alliance vs Horde, or maybe even in one like Blade and Soul, or especially Elder Scrolls Online. Maybe 1 month down the line, the Aldmeri Dominion capitalizes on their sheer numbers and takes over the keeps in CYRODIL, and then claims the emperorship for their top player as a result. In these scenarios, the other 2 factions will usually band together to take down the top dogs, or maybe the top and mid faction may ally to bully the lowest faction into submission. It's an endless cycle for the most part, but one thing to note about New World is it might actually have a bigger impact on the players than expected. And just in case you didn't remember, we will in fact have a tax system available for the settlements where we will pay regularly for a few different things. One seems related to crafting, another for refining, and also of course housing. And the last one appears to be related to trading. These are set by governing companies, and these companies act as proxies for the faction as a whole. One of the concerns that has been brought up by the community is the fact that we can live together with enemy faction players, but this may end up proving to be something that's not as worrisome as it may sound. But taxation might play a big part in this, because if a faction gets too powerful and decides to attack a specific area or a set of them, there may not be anything to stop them from inflating the taxes to hinder the residents that live there. And they could easily refuse to continue the upkeep for those lands, along with letting the invasions of the Horde waltz right in. And normally if you were to let the Horde win, this would be very bad, as it would incur real penalties for your territory, just like crafting benches or crafting levels being downgraded. But for an enemy faction to do it to a settlement that you live in, this could be used as a tactic for war. And since we only get about 1,000 to 2,000 players per server, depending on how many territories we get at the start, one faction may be able to easily multi-attack different ones and mass downgrade them to hinder the faction that lives there. It has been said though that there will be systems in place that work against that, where the most underpopulated factions will have bonuses that make them feel more like an underdog as opposed to being out for the count. And on the other side of that, the more territories a faction has means that they will also get bonuses or rewards that give them an edge in one way or another. This is something to keep in mind though, because there will be many ways to combat things like this, like players banding together to fight the oppressive tactics, but from what they've described from the system, early on it could be very vulnerable to abuse while they're working these systems into place. And if we've learned anything from the past, the history of sandbox games gets built over months, if not years at a time. And the stories for those who rise up to take on the mantle of tyranny a lot of times don't end so well for them. And whether it's in real life or an online game, if you believe in something or want to protect your virtual way of life, sometimes there will need to be a fight for it. From what I've seen so far, I haven't really seen a lot of advertisements on YouTube or that little purple platform when it comes to this game. They have had a lot of media coverage of course, but it feels like they haven't even scratched the surface of what they could do to push this game out as a product out to people. So what I feel like is going to happen is when the beta comes around, or launch even, a lot of the people that go live on that specific purple platform are going to come over to this one. I've got a feeling that just by the look of this game alone, it has the potential to pull a lot of eyes to it. You'll see the servers get flooded upon flooded flooded with people running around and interacting with the game world. I don't think we'll have to worry about the mob density in the highest level zones, at least for a little bit, but I have a strong feeling that the newbie zones and even the mid-tier zones are going to be getting torn up constantly, even with the server cap of 1 to 2,000. I do hope that Amazon has prepared for this sort of thing, and so far, it does seem like they're taking precautions such as showcasing new territories we haven't seen before in previous diaries, like the region of Morningdale and Cutlass Keys that we saw just recently. One thing that would help with this if they haven't done it already is setting up multiple spawn zones so that everyone isn't crammed all into one area. But overall, we're just going to have to see where they decide to go with this one. But if it starts getting out of hand, I suspect they'll be working fast to tweak this so that players can have faster respawns or more mobs to work with. And for the second to last one, this is the other side of the density issues that you would normally see in games, and that is resource density. Now this one I feel like it might have a bigger impact at later levels than mob density. And this is because when it comes to resources, usually at the higher levels you'll start to get into the territory of witnessing some pretty long respawn timers for these types of things. Some games might put a system in place where you have to compete with other players through the form of open world PvP to secure in-game resources. And that gives you the opportunity to defend the spawns of them if you have the time and power to do so. But for various reasons that they've made clear, New World does not have this feature. And sometimes even as little as 1 to 4 players could make a big enough impact on resource density in an area to completely wipe out all the nodes till the next respawn. Just ask Life is Feudal. So even with only having 1 to 2,000 players per server in New World, if the game ends up pooling everyone into the same exact places when it comes to the highest level zones, it's possible that we could see big droughts for quite a while when it comes to securing the materials we need to support the crafters. There are some solutions, however, on how they can work to resolve an issue like this, and one of them is allowing us to farm crafting materials off of mobs and monsters themselves. It doesn't have to be a huge amount, of course, because that might make gathering resources feel almost non-important at that point, but being able to gather a good chunk of our resources and money through grinding mobs could alleviate the stress it would put on gatherers. And just like with getting to in-game progression, it's better to have multiple ways of getting to the destination, even if some are tedious and boring, than having just one single method of getting to it that some people may or may not want to do. Hopefully this will be something that we won't have to worry too much about, and if they needed to, I would be glad to see something along the lines of being able to buy materials from NPC merchants, even if it's a limited feature. It seems like we will of course have access to a trading market that we can probably buy and sell those things from, but making use of NPC traders could also help further alleviate this concern. And that leads me to the final issue that may arise during the game's beta or launch phase, and that's the economy issue. And unlike the last two topics, this one has to do with just about everything. The money, the resources, the gear, all that fun stuff that's going to build the backbone of our experience. And this one could certainly be as important of an issue as any other. One thing we've touched on many times already is how, because of the game is now going a different route when it comes to the open world PvP, we are going to be stepping into an altogether different environment. So players will be able to safely gather everything, whether it's a simple node of iron or an in-game node of orichalcum. What this means is that players could potentially reach that peak of in-game crafting much faster than they could if they needed to fight for these resources. And my biggest fear, if I had to talk about at least one for this game, would be what happened when Legends of Aria went down the same route. Granted, this is a whole other game, dev team and beast altogether, but what happened in that one specifically is that almost at the last minute, the open world PvP aspect was changed. What followed from my eyes as one of the people that played at launch was that a whole lot of people were able to skyrocket in progression almost to the point of it being scary. I saw house plots being bought almost the same day at launch and people being able to farm and grind in-game resources within the span of 24 hours. Fast forward a week from that point and houses were being built like crazy, with resources and starting zones being incredibly scarce, while players were selling almost any and all gear pieces you would need on their plots of land. Because of this, market prices started to shoot down because players will always of course try to undermine other people's pricing to make a sale. But the rate at which this happened seemed like it did a lot more harm to the game than good. There are of course ways to help with this, like making progression enough of a grind so that not everyone will have the patience to reach those heights right away, and therefore making the max level of progression take longer, but I'm sure there also has to be better ways of going about balancing the economy part of this. I do think that players should be able to progress through these professions without it feeling too tedious, even for someone who enjoys that kind of thing, but I do hope that they have a system in place or content plan laid out so that we don't run into a stopgap almost right away. And as we talked about in the beginning, these are all issues that can be fixed up with a little tender love and a whole lot of patching. But I wanted to make sure that we had this conversation before the game went into its testing phase. It's important to be prepared for these scenarios so that we might be a little bit more patient with the devs so they can take what they need to fix from our feedback and do what needs to be done to make this game capable of being more than we've had for the previous years. And these are things that I would love to not happen at all, and that goes for all upcoming titles. But these are the harsh realities of MMOs, and if we want that golden age back, it's about time we started doing our best to help deal with them. I don't want us to continue that cycle of hype after hype and game jump after game jump. If it just means that in all that downtime we feel empty or envious of those who had already found their favorite games of the genre and are able to stick with them for months or even years at a time, or just being able to have fun with them. For me personally, I'm ready to break that wheel within myself and stay focused for once. In conclusion though, please let me know how you feel about this discussion and if you think any or all of these issues are minor or major ones. Let me know if you think these are issues that could arise or you don't expect them to happen in the slightest. I'll read through as much of it as I possibly can. And with that folks, thank you all again for taking the time out to check out this video, and I hope you all have a wonderful night or day. And farewell.